Good evening. Make sure this thing's on. Good. First thing I want to do is just thank everyone who come out tonight. I know I sent a message. I kind of did a little bit of a Devo Wednesday about, our Sunday nights and trying to, kind of bring them back a little bit. COVID and just a lot of life, right? Really gotten away, and I think got us kind of out of the habit. So I just really appreciate seeing all of y'all out here tonight. What we're going to do is I'm starting a message, and I sent it out and let everyone know. It's called Back to the Start, and tonight it's going to be a 5-week series. And the first week is titled "Let It Go," and we're gonna talk about that here in a little bit. But one of the things I talked about Wednesday night is we've seen a lot of change in the last few years, the last few months, and the last few weeks. It's just been hectic. I mean, a lot of different things that we've had to go through personally with us and as a congregation. Affect with mom and dad and everyone. So, just between a bunch of different things. And so, I thought this would be a good opportunity to start and do a lesson like this or a series like this, and kind of go back and look at the beginning, back to the start, back to the beginning of the church and what that looked like. And so, the reason part of that too is because the world that we live in no longer looks like the world that most of us grew up in. I mean, I think back, and I've tried to feel like I'm not that old, but I mean, I graduated high school in 1999, which really isn't that long ago. All right, 22 years, 23 years? And I look at the differences between when I graduated high school and what the world was like and what the world is like now. I look 3 or 4 years ago, and then you look at what the world was like 3 or 4 years ago versus what the world is like now. But here's part of the problem, and I think about those who are older. I mean, you think about what the world looked like in 1950, 1960, 1970, some of you are in 80s and 90s that we all grew up in, and it's just completely different. But here's part of the problem that we have, especially in the church. The church has been left behind. And what I mean by that is the church has not really, in a lot of senses, kept up with all the changes in our society, a lot of the changes that have gone out in the world. In a sense, we kind of did this in COVID too. We've kind of pulled back, and we've kind of isolated ourselves a little bit. And we've kind of resisted a lot of these changes, and some of them for good reason. We kind of fought back against them. And then the other thing that we're seeing a lot of, especially here recently, is a lot of people are being hurt by the church. And a lot of it's becoming more to light. For a long time, people were afraid to come forward if something bad had happened to them. But now it just seems like it's just like a pouring out all of a sudden. And so my thought is, and this is where I want to go with this series, is my thought is this should hopefully pertain to you whether you have been in the church, been a member of the church 60 years, whether you're a new Christian, or whether you may be fall into this category of people who've been hurt by the church and you're and I'm beyond good reasons why they are. Where I want to hit is I want you to let everything that you've learned about the church, about all of it, I want you to try to forget it. Not just the Church of Christ. I'm talking about Christendom in itself. We as humans, we don't like change. Me and Ken were talking about this the other night. We're resistant to change. It's just kind of our human nature. But here's the thing: as you look through it, most Christians resist the church. Resistant, and we're going to look at those as we lesson today. And so from the outside, this first. I hope. That's my intent. It was challenging for me as I went through, it was a challenge. I hope that it is a challenge to you, because anytime we try to move and pull ourselves out of our, it is uncomfortable. It should be challenging. And it may be a little emotional. But the first thing I want to outside, I can answer this. How does the outside of the church? Wrong answer. I hope some and good, but judgmental. The only ones going to heaven. And so as we struggle through some of these, that's some of those things are legitimate, right? Because we've allowed some of that stuff to happen or to be seen. I had a conversation one time with a boss of mine because I was mad about something, and he basically said, in a nice way, if that's the way they see it, then that's the way it is, right? Whether you agree with it or not, if that's how they see that you did something, then that's the way it is in their mind, whether that was your intention or whether that was your intention or not. And so sometimes us as Christians, we mess up in that. So from the outside, and this is just a very broad, very general or definition, the church is a community of people who are teaching of a man sent from God to explain God and to clear a path to God. Just very, I guess if you want to boil it down to the basics of what maybe some of the people on the outside would see from the church. And then some of the things that we mentioned here. But see, here's the thing. This is not what God intended for the church to look like. If we actually go through and look, and we're going to hit some of this today, what he wanted the church to look like shouldn't be resistible. What he wanted the church to look like should be irresistible. And if you look at Jesus, he had three major things that he wanted us to do. The church, God, love one another, your enemy. If you take those three things and put them in the simplest form, if you break down and put it in the simplest form of what the gospel of Jesus was for him, for what he wanted us to do, this was it. And so you look at something like that, and it's like, what is there to resist about that? I mean, these people are going to love God, they're going to be loving to one another, and they're going to love their enemies. I mean, why wouldn't you want to be part of that? And so when we look at Christianity, and we look at the world, when the world sees us, the only thing that the world should see when they see the church, and the only thing that should be resistible, is our loyalty to Jesus Christ. The only thing they should see this, right? Because if you actually look at the first century church, for the first 300 years, it was irresistible to a lot of people. Because they hate the church, because right, they thought they were better than everyone. They didn't hate the main reason, if you look at the New Testament church, the main reason they were persecuted and people went after them was because they refused to say Caesar was Lord. If you look at their main reason for persecution, it was because they said, you know what, Jesus is our king. They didn't hate them because they were going into disease-affected areas and treating people. They didn't resist them because they were taking orphans in. They didn't resist them because they were loving one another, because all these things. They did that because they refused to say that Caesar was Lord. And you think of that. Wouldn't that be awesome if today, the church, if we looked at the church, and people said, well, you know what, I just can't be part of that because you think Jesus is the Son of God. I could live with that. I went to someone and they said, you're a nice guy, you're great, but I like you and I like your church, man, your people, but you believe that Jesus guy is the Son of God, I can't be a part of that. You know what? I can tell you, because that's the only part of that. You know, you think about it. Wouldn't it be nice if you mentioned a church of Christians and they were like, man, Christians are the best neighbors. I love, if I'm going to move into a neighborhood, I'm going to try to find someone next door and say, hey, man, are you a Christian? They're the best coworkers. Man, if I want to work in a place, I'm going to try to make sure my cubicle is next to someone who's a Christian. You know, I may not believe in Jesus, but I'm going to make sure that my child marries one of these Christians because Check this out, man. It is unreal the way they treat their women. Right? They put them up and they treat them better than anyone's ever seen. Or lastly, and I think some of y'all that work in food service, what if they said that they are the greatest customers they've ever had on Sunday afternoons? Wouldn't it be great if the only complaint that the world had against us was that we were too committed to Jesus? Because I'll be honest with you, I've never heard that. I've never heard, well, I'm not going to have anything to do with your church because you just believe Jesus is the Son of God. I can't take that. I've heard a lot of reasons, and a lot of very good reasons, to be honest with you. And some of the reasons I've heard, if they'd happened to me, I probably wouldn't have anything to do with the church either. And so I was reading a book the other day, and it was written by a minister who had gone overseas to China. And as part of going overseas to China, they were touring a factory, and it was a factory that produces American goods, sends them to Lowe's, Home Depot, Walmart, those type of places. And as part of this factory tour, they had this young lady following along with them. She was learning how to give the tours in this factory, going through. And at the end of the tour, they said, hey, do y'all have any questions for us? And they asked a couple questions, and then the girl who hadn't really said anything the whole time, who's kind of back behind them and out of the way, kind of raised her hand and said, can I ask a question? I'm like, yeah. And the question was, are you a pastor? And he said, yeah, I am. And she said, well, I have a question for you. And the question was, why doesn't everybody in America go to church? And what he had found out, and the reason she asked this question, was she was a recent convert to Christianity. And for those of you who are familiar with China, I know Terry is very familiar with China and the way things worked over there, is they have a lot of what they would call unregistered or underground churches, or non-government sanctioned churches, right? For the most part, you can go to church as long as it's a government-sanctioned church, but she was going to one of the underground churches. And it was dangerous for her, but she loved it. She absolutely loved it because everyone was so kind, everyone was so loving, everyone was just, it was what God had intended for the church to be. And she said, I've heard that you have churches everywhere in America, but that most of your people don't go to church. And she didn't understand. She couldn't understand why. And he had no answer for her. He said, I can't give you an answer. And so her question and her thought boils down to, why doesn't, or who doesn't, want their life to be better and to be better at life? Because here's the thing, whether you believe Jesus is the Son of God or not, if you follow the teachings of Jesus, your life will be better. There's no, that's been studied. There's research in that says if you're a Christian, Christians live longer. They usually live healthier lives. There's all these statistics that fall into that. And so she had a great question. So the question is if this is what Jesus intended the church to be, and these are the things that we're supposed to be doing, what happened? How did we become so irresistible? How do we become to the point to where you mention the church and people are going to run away from you, right, or have nothing to do with you? And so what I hope is that we are going to look at this as we go through this series and go through several of these things. But what we're going to find out is the irresistible part of the church, or why a lot of people don't want to have anything to do with Jesus or the church, is not because that we believe Jesus is God. That's very little to do with it, to be honest with you. We're going to find out that what has happened, and a lot of people would say, hey, well, it's because we've brought all these new things into the church, right? We've added all these new things, and there's probably some merit to that. But the biggest thing we're actually going to see is that it's the result of old things being added back in. And so we're going to look at that, and we're going to look at what I've called the old model. The old model is a representation of basically all ancient religions and many religions of the world that we see today. This goes back to Babylon, the Romans. We're going to see the Jewish old model of religion. Like I said, today, 4 components: sacred places, sacred men, and sincere followers. And I'll tell you what I mean by sincere followers. If you look at all the old model religion, even the Jewish list, there was a sacred place, right? The temple. And that temple is what you went to, right? And other religions, they had other temples that they had built to their gods. There were mountains that were sacred places. And they had all these sacred locations where that location was pretty much the only place that you could worship God or worship their god or their gods. Or a lot of times there was a temple built for every god. And so you had that. And then you had sacred texts. Now, these texts were sometimes written by men, sometimes supposedly written given to them by the gods, all that stuff. But those sacred texts were stored in those locations. And then you had men who controlled and interpreted those texts. Those sacred men were the ones who were in charge of whether people could come in and see those texts. And they were the ones who held on to them. And in most situations, in most religions that you saw in the old model, it was only the special men who had access to God or the gods or the text. And then you had the sincere followers that the men told, hey, you have to do these things, and if you don't do these things, you're going to be punished. Or if you don't do these things, then you're going to go to hell. Or you have to do these things, and then you go to heaven. And so to kind of give you some examples of that, we see that in, I think people are maybe familiar with some of the African, anyone in here familiar with African witch doctors? If you've ever studied that, it's an interesting thing. The African witch doctors in their areas, this is them. They can say, they've set up sacred areas with them. Right? And they say things. If the witch doctor says to do something or interpret something, then you better do that or you're going to be punished or you're going to be in trouble. They have an extraordinary power. Bob Goff, if you ever read any of his books, he talks about this where he actually went in to some of these areas as a Christian and they worked in these areas. And it was scary. Very scary because they had such great power. We see this in the Middle East, right? With certain religions where they are taught, right, to do things, and they ask people to do things in the name of their religion that we just can't understand. It's like, how could that possibly be? And so that this old model, this old religious model that we've seen since the start of history is a lot of the reason we're going to look at why some of the church has come into the church and why it's a little bit, it becomes irresistible. Because I want you to think about this for a minute. Anyone who can stand up here or stand in front of a people or tell a group of people, if you don't do this exactly, then you're going to hell, that person has a lot of power. And so you have to be careful with how you use this because the old model grants extraordinary power to sacred men in sacred places who determine the meaning of sacred texts. We've seen that in a lot of situations in some current religions, especially a lot of older religions. And so you can probably tell, aren't we kind of running that? Don't we have someone sit up here telling us what? And then you're going to heaven, or if you're going to hell. And so we're going to look at some of that in this series. Now, don't get me way off. I'm not going to say I'm not saying we stop doing what we're doing. But I want us to look at how that looks and how we need to make sure that we're aware of how we come across when we're doing things like this, and we have to be careful. And so we're going to look at that as we go through. So the thing is a lot of old stuff has trickled back into religion and back into church that way. And here's why. The arrival of Jesus signaled the end, of the old model and the beginning of something entirely brand new. And I want you to, because I think sometimes and sometimes I'll be honest with you, I wish our Bible was literally broken up, and we had the Old Testament over here, and we had the Gospels here, and then we had the rest of the Bible over here. And I'll tell you why, because we've kind of pushed it all together, and we've kind of granted the same meaning and same relevancy to some things in the Bible that we really shouldn't. And so we've got to work that way and work that through and look at it, because Jesus came and he started a brand new movement. I say a new starting point because it was a brand new starting point. There were no more sacred places. Under Jesus, there's no more sacred places. Ken Carter, under Jesus, is more sacred than any location ever will be. There's no more sacred or special people, right? There's no more high priests. I talked about this a couple Sundays ago. We're all high priests in Christ now. Every single one of us. There's no one who's more special in Jesus than another person. And so we no longer have to go to a place or go to someone who goes to God on our behalf, right? And the sacred text that we had, which was the Old Testament, Jesus came, and I love this about Jesus. He came and he boiled all that down into one word, to one verb, to a single verb. And we're going to look at that verb. So as we see this, so not only did Jesus start something entirely brand new, Jesus predicted a new movement. Let me get a drink here real quick. Jesus predicted, on his way to Caesarea Philippi, it was known as Philippi until Jesus was about a teenager, and then they renamed it Caesarea, and some people called it Caesarea Philippi, but this was to honor Caesar Augustus. And so Jesus took this as an example with his apostles, and they said, we know who Caesar is. Who do you think I am? And there was a bunch of different things given. He's like, some say you're the reincarnation of John the Baptist. Some say you're an apostle or reincarnation of some of the apostles. But Peter said, you are Jesus the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus said, you're right. You didn't come up with this on your own. God told you that. And then he continues on in Matthew 16:18. He says, now I say to you that you are Peter, which means rock, and upon this rock I will build my church. Here's the problem. The word church should have never been put in the English Bible. The word church there is the Greek word ekklesia, which means gathering or assembly. He announced a brand new movement, not a brand new place or a brand new place of worship. He says, my movement is going to be a group of people, and I'm going to be there among them no matter where they're at. And so as we look at this in history, what's interesting, the first translation, the first English Bible, actually translated this, I believe it was gathering. Anyone want to know who translated the word church as gathering in the first English Bible? It was William Tyndale. I don't know if any of you have maybe heard of the Tyndale version of the Bible. He was the first person to translate it into English, and he also had the audacity to make sure that it said assembly or gathering, and he was killed for it. They burned him at the stake, one for translating the Bible into English for the common man, but because of some of the terminology he used. They went on later, the leaders at that time would go on, and we're going to look at that in a couple weeks. We're going to actually do a history lesson in 2 weeks. But the leaders at that time would go on to translate and use the word church. And the word that they used for church was a German word. And it meant house of the Lord or sacred place. So there was some purpose behind this, because they were trying to keep that old in the church. And we're going to look at that in a couple of weeks. But Jesus said, no, this has come to an end. This is my gathering. We're going to build a congregation, and I'm going to be with them wherever that congregation is, despite what building or holy place or ground that they're on. So then Jesus went on to and he go to the high priest, right? High priest sacrifice on your behalf, and you had to do this every single year. You couldn't go to God. But now Jesus said, no, this is open to everyone now. This is all mankind. So if we look in Luke 22:20, he says, after the supper he took another cup of wine and said, this cup is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. They had no clue what he was talking about when he told them this. They really didn't. And they really didn't fully understand it until they saw him hanging on the cross. He was for all time. So then, meaning to the sacred text. You know, the sacred text before was the Old Testament, the laws, their teachings that they had. And so one day he was teaching, and what he said to them, I am sure shocked them, and I'm sure there was probably just a hush that went over the crowd, because a lot of this we missed because we weren't there. We didn't understand a lot of the old ways that they were in. But he said in Matthew 5:17, don't misunderstand why I've come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose, or as some translations say, fulfill them. This was huge. This was absolutely huge. Jesus was standing in the middle of these people and saying that the entire Old Testament funneled down to him. Everything that was written, all the prophecies, that they were about him. That the law pointed to him, led to him, and is going to end with him. And I'm going to later write about this. Look at this. But it's now Jesus saying, look, all this points to me. This is all about me. I'm wrapping all this up. I'm going to take care of it, and you're no longer going to be required or under the servitude of 10 commandments and 630 laws. He boiled it down. He takes and he boils it all down, and he starts a new command, and he institutes a new movement defining ethic. And it's a very, very simple one. We're going to go deep into this ethic in week 4. But in John 13:34, Jesus says, so now I'm giving you a new command. This is a new commandment now. Right? The old ones are going away. I'm giving you a new one. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love one another. Now, the apostles at this point kind of had an idea of what he was talking about. Right? Because here's what he had just done. And I know this is going to gross Helen out, because she hates feet. But he had just washed their feet. All right? And I want you to think about this in this day and age, because this was the hands of Jesus. Had healed people, had touched leopards, had healed all kind of just sick, infested people, right? And this isn't like today where if I were to take my shoes and socks off, my feet are pretty clean, right? So if you had to wipe them down with water and towel, for the most part, it might not gross most of you, right? This wasn't the way back then. They walked on dirt roads. They walked on the same roads that their camels and their goats and all their other stuff. So they were stepping in nasty stuff, right? They had manure and they had dirt and they had just nastiness in between their toes. I want to see how far I can go before Helen starts saying. But they understood what he was talking about, because he was willing to do, Jesus was willing to do. He took the entire leadership paradigm and flipped it on his head, because Jesus was willing to do for them what they were not willing to do for each other. They were all sitting there. It was customary for that to happen. So Jesus takes the towel, sits down, and washes their feet. And so this is where us in the church ever get to thinking that, you know what, I'm one of these sacred people, right? I've been a Christian for a long time, or I've been, a deacon for a long time, or I've been an elder, or I went to this school and I have this master's degree or this doctorate, and I know if you ever get to thinking that you're something special in the church, you need to get a towel and you need to start washing people's dirty feet. That is what the movement of Jesus was supposed to look like. That is what it looked like. It was us washing each other's nasty feet. And so then he goes further on and says, your love, in verse 35 there, if they're on 13, your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. So he says love is going to replace law-keeping. Self-sacrifice is going to replace animal sacrifice. The vertical will now be measured by the horizontal. And what I mean by that, when I say the vertical, right, the things that make you right with God are going to be measured this way. God, it's going to be based on, we're going to look at this in Matthew, right? It's based on the horizontal. Treat people and how you love is going to determine this. He says that you're going to be by how much you pray, how much you read your Bible. Now, these are things you need to be doing. All right, don't get me wrong. But it's not based upon how much you pray. It's not how much you attend church. It's not how much you give. It's not how many times you take communion in your lifetime. It's going to be based on how well you love the people that are most difficult to love. That is what's going to be measured and show whether you're a disciple of Christ. And then Jesus went and did probably the most offensive thing he could have done in that time, and he gave new meaning to the Passover. And I used an example of this about a month or two ago. We had communion. I talked about how we should, do communion for me now. Right? And this is equivalent to what he was doing. This would be the equivalent of me getting up here and saying, hey, I'm writing a letter to dedication. When I die, from now on, I want you guys to celebrate Easter in my name. All right? And then also, from now on, I want you to celebrate Christmas. I want you to celebrate my birth. All right? So this is the new thing I want you to do. So going forward, after I die, I want you to celebrate my death on Easter in the name of Chad. And I want you to celebrate my birth at Christmas in the name of Chad. And then from now on, when we do communion, I want you to do Chad. How many of y'all are going to be, if I was serious, how many of y'all would be extremely offended by that? You should be, and you should walk out of here. Right? That's what the apostles, in all seriousness, when they heard Jesus, it shows the faith they had in who he was. Jesus says here in 22:19, and gave thanks to God for it, then he broke it in pieces. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And Moses delivering the Israelites, this isn't about you. But they didn't. Jesus came and he changed who the Passover was, a new meaning, and that's why we celebrate it, or we talk about it. Chris talked about it this morning. That's why we take part in it every single Sunday. So to summarize, the arrival of Jesus signaled the end of the old model and the beginning of something entirely brand new. There were no more sacred places. There were no more special people or sacred people. There were no more sacred texts. And this is the interesting thing. For the first 300 years, for the most part, the church didn't have a Bible. Some of them may have had a couple letters. But they spread the church, especially at the very beginning, the first 50, 60 years, they spread the church with nothing but the Word of God and word of mouth. And they grew. I mean, they were adding thousands of people to the Gospels. It wasn't later on until 50, 60 years later that they started getting copies of these. And it wasn't 300 to 400 years later until it was all compiled and put in a book. So for the first several hundred years of the church, it was word of mouth. And so he took and that's the thing. He took those sacred texts and he reduced them to one word, which was love. And that love was to love God, love your neighbors, and to love your enemies. And he said, if you do these things, you are my disciples. Now, there's a lot that filters back into that, but he just brought it down and simplified it so much. You just can't imagine the simplicity of what Christianity was versus the old model that they had. And then we see that after the resurrection, the ascension, like I talked about, man, the church just took off. But then what started to happen? Right? The old model, they wanted to start bringing the old model back in. And the first representation of that was circumcision. And then we're going to look at, I think it's week 3, it's going to be literally basically a history lesson of the church and how the church and Christianity has slowly allowed all these old things to kind of come back in. And so they allowed things that should have been left behind to be blended in because as humans, we have trouble getting rid of traditions, right? We kind of have that consciences. We hold on to things. We've always done it this way. And so we got to bring that old stuff back. And like I said, so unfortunately, a lot of what we see in Christianity and a lot of why the world and people in the world don't want to have anything to do with tends to feed back to a lot of the old things that we've allowed back in. But here's the thing I know. We can figure this out. Right? We can let go of some things that are holding the church back. I truly believe that. I wouldn't be up here teaching this lesson if I didn't believe that. And so we're going to continue. We're going to go back to that starting point. We're going to remember we're going to look at what Jesus had in mind, and we're going to continue to keep that. Because here's the wonderful thing about Jesus and the message of Jesus. It works for anyone, no matter what your background is, what your religious tradition has been, any of that stuff. It works for you no matter what your history and no matter what your background looks like. And here's what I truly believe. I believe, one of the things I always say, we call ourselves the Church of Christ. And I love that idea. I love that idea of doing everything we can to be like the New Testament church and be the Church of Christ. Myself, I set us to a high standard. If we're going to call ourselves that, I believe we should set ourselves to the highest standard under that. But I believe we can become what we aspire to be under that. So here's the thing. For all this to happen, you're going to have to be back next week. I got 10 minutes left. Or I don't even have 10 minutes. I've gone over a little bit. So be back next week because we're going to, the next week's lesson is called Cut It Off. And we're going to look at how Paul told us we need to cut things off. And it's a very serious thing that he's talking about. I'm not going to go into the details. But it's a very serious thing. Let's pray. Dear God, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the opportunity and the freedom we have to come and worship you, to study your word, Lord. And I just ask that you bless us and allow us to open our hearts to looking at being the church that you want us to be and being the people and the movement and the gathering that you called us to be, and that we use what we learn here to go out and use it to change the world for you, Lord. I ask that you continue to bless us as we go through this series. Help me to say the right things and do the right things and present the correct message. And it's in Christ let me pray. Amen. The other thing we always do is we offer an invitation. I don't know if anyone's in here if there's anyone in here who's not a Christian, but if you're not, I'm telling you there's no better time than right now to come and give your life to Christ. Right? And like I always say when I'm up here, you can come forward. If you want to come up here and talk to me, you can talk to me. We'll look at what it takes, to become a Christian. But if you're just like, hey, I'm not comfortable coming up here, grab me, grab someone in this audience who you know. I'll tell you, we'll study with you, and we'll do it, and we'll do it tonight. I don't care if we've got to stay up till midnight to do it. And the other thing we always offer as well is, we got several people, members of the church here, and as a church, we're a family. We're a family. We're to show that love to one another. And if someone's got something going on, we need to help each other. Now, if you want to come up here and you want to say, hey, Chad, I need the prayers of the church, please do that, you can do that. But if not, just come to some of us, right? We'll get together in a group and pray for you or do whatever we got to do. But please, come down and do that.